at a United Methodist Seminary this year. And I've been thinking a lot about teaching as a disciple of Jesus Christ. Disciple, of course, being a word that means student. So as a fellow student suddenly entrusted with teaching other students of Christ, I'm thinking a lot about teaching this year. So this presentation is offering 3 examples of lesson plans from my seminary classrooms that I think also work or that I've also taught in congregations. And I'm aware that our work in teaching, we are teaching teachers. We are teaching people who are also going to go out in congregations, and nonprofits, and work for the denomination and teach. So just a quick word to begin. My classroom in many ways represents the church. It's racially and ethnically diverse. We have a large number of international students. We have diversity of gender and gender identity and expression. And my students are also theologically diverse. I'll give you just one example. So this past semester, on the first day of class in my gender and sexuality in early Christianity in the spring, yes, I was teaching a class on gender and sexuality in early Christianity this semester of the special general conference. You wonder why I'm thinking about teaching. I asked students to write on the board something about who they are and something about why they're taking this class, what they care about. So I had one student write, "As a queer woman of color, I'm concerned about the capitalist cis heteropatriarchy." About half of my students did this, and didn't know all the words that had just been said. I had another student get up and write on the board, "As an African Catholic priest, I'm concerned about the gays and homosexuals." And I had another half of my students flinch with the way that was articulated. So that's my classroom, that's the church, and that's the context in which we teach. So 3 lessons. So first, one of my primary objectives when teaching about the Bible and sexuality is to have students learn that our understandings of sex, gender, and sexuality are historically and culturally bound, and they change over time. So I often start class with the genderbread person. You might be familiar with this. It's a really simple way for students to learn about the difference between sex, gender orientation, gender identity, etc. It helps my students be precise in their terminology when they are saying something. And I have plenty of students for whom this is totally new. And I have some of them who are like, "I'm not sure what I think about this," but that's okay. I then have students draw the genderbread person of antiquity. So here you'll see drawings from 2 student groups. The one on the left is based on ancient Greek and Roman medical literature, and the one on the right is based on Plato's Symposium. So I asked students, what would it look like to draw the genderbread person of this text for this community, this type of way of thinking in antiquity? And my students are often shocked to read medical literature and to learn that everyone is male in antiquity. Women are just not fully developed males. Therefore, your gender spectrum in antiquity runs from men to unmen. They're shocked to learn that for the ancient Greeks, ovaries are undescended testes, and that whether or not you turned into a man or unman depended upon whether you were hot or cold in utero. When encountering this, if students can agree on nothing else, they can agree that sex, gender, and sexuality are understood differently in antiquity. And this creates a baseline for students before moving into biblical texts. So what would it look like to have congregants do this kind of an activity, and perhaps also add in various biblical texts? For example, what if you had students read Philo's reading of the 2 creation accounts alongside having them do this for Genesis 1 and 2? Second, I ask students to deliberate as the Corinthian assemblies. I do this for a few reasons. The first and most important, I can't teach New Testament and early Christianity about sexuality without teaching about gender and slavery. They are concomitant with each other. That's where scholarship is, and it's one of the greatest failures I see in translating scholarship to congregations. We isolate sexuality from gender and slavery, and they're just deeply intertwined in history and within biblical texts. This activity that I'm about to talk about also helps students practice living in the tension that Lutheran biblical scholar, theologian, Christopher Stendahl describes in his essay, Why I Love the Bible. The Bible is all about me, and the Bible is not all about me. And last, students learn that there are disagreements about gender and sexuality that throughout Christianity. It's not new. And they're not recent, but what they're talking about is just different than what we're talking about. So I have students read 1 Corinthians 7, and I asked them, congratulations, you are now members of a first century Corinthian assembly. You got this letter from Paul. What the heck is Paul asking you to do? What is Paul asking you not to do? How does that matter if you're a woman, if you're an enslaved person? How does thinking about your identity differently affect the ways that you read this letter and the instructions you get? And then I always ask my students, what questions do you still have? Because I promise you, we have 2 Corinthians, because the Corinthians also had questions too. So there's some common themes that my students regularly noted. They're shocked. Paul wants no sex. That's what Paul wants. They often note that the reason for Paul's instructions are because the present form of this world is passing away versus some notion of sin that they might have. They often note and flag for me, there's no notion of consent in this text. Even when they're talking about a husband and a wife, there's no notion of what we think is important in our understanding of marriage as consent. And they often note slaves in the same passage on sex are told to remain as they are, which has lots of consequences for the rest of the instructions. There's lots of scholarship on this. The great thing about this is you don't have to have your congregations go read Greek medical literature. They can do this activity right now. They are equipped. They will notice these same things. This works great as an activity. So last, and this is a kind of compilation of two different lessons and a bit of a continuation of my previous point, but I cannot speak highly enough about having students and congregants read womanist literature. Students really get some of those points when they read Mitzi Smith's Womanist Sass and Talkback, and I also use Will Gaffney's Questions for Praxis found in Womanist Midrash. It's literally a set of 10 or 12 questions that any student can take to a biblical text and just start to see it in a new way. So I want students in this activity to consider what knowledge they assume about their own context and to consider how asking questions differently can help read familiar texts in a new way. And I want them to begin to contemplate what Jonathan Walton calls, how can the Bible still inform ethical decisions and political choices in a radically different world than the one that produced it? So what I do is I ask students to go around our building, and I ask them what evidence about sex, gender, and sexuality will still be around in 250 years, 500 years, 1,000 years from now. Students are often surprised with what they find, or more often what they don't find. So Drew University has a woman as its current president and provost. Our school has 2 women as associate deans, has a great gender balance among the faculty. But when you look for things that aren't on paper, when you look for things that will last throughout all these years, it's a little more difficult to find evidence. And students often notice, for example, really interesting things about our bathrooms. I remind them that folks in the 21st, in centuries from now, might think that people in the 21st century might think that we choose which bathroom to use based on what people are wearing. Or they might think if we do choose bathrooms based on some notion of gender, that all women wear dresses and must wear dresses in order to use a bathroom. And I often do this and share them with them photos of ancient toilets in which there's no privacy, there's no stalls, and just understandings of how we think about these things matters. And we need to look at our text. We also need to look at our contexts around us. I bet you would learn some really interesting things in your local congregation if you had them go around and look at their churches and ask them what might still be around in a while to share, to think about some of these themes. So I'd like to close by sharing some bibliography and some additional resources. I've already mentioned Will Gaffney and again Mitzi Smith, all the womanist literature, and it's all really accessibly written too. It works well. I've had students take, especially Mitzi Smith's book, and go immediately lead a book study in a local congregation with it. This is not scholarship that goes over your head. I really recommend Darren Guest's The Queer Bible Commentary. If you're not engaging with scholars who are doing queer theory or doing queer biblical studies right now in your congregation that is trying to be affirming, then there's an educational and discipleship improvement that can be made. I have personally taught a whole semester-long book study on Jennifer Knuth's Unprotected Texts. It's worked really well in local congregations and has some great study questions that can accompany it. This one I can't recommend highly enough. Joe Marshall, it just came out, edited a book called Bodies on the Verge, Queering Pauline Epistles. And my friend and colleague, the Reverend Dr. Tyler Schwaller, has a chapter in it specifically on queer theory and slavery. It's really great. And he's a United Methodist deacon out of Iowa. Krister Stendhal's Why I Love the Bible has some really great, I would say, baseline biblical theology for students to start thinking creatively with. I got to give a shout out to my Drew colleagues here. Stephen Moore, God's Gym and God's Beauty Parlor. I sign those every semester. I've mentioned Mitzi Smith's Woman is Sass and Talkback. And again, Jonathan Walton's A Lens of Love, Reading the Bible in Its World for Our World, is a constructive theological project about what it means to read the Bible in a progressive theological lens today, and really wrestles with pretty hard questions. So I recommend that as well if that fits your congregational context as well. And the last thing is I really hope that our time together in the Q&A session isn't just going to be you all peppering me with questions, but you all have wisdom and knowledge from your own disciplines and your own fields and your own many more years of teaching, and that together we might start to share together some resources that we have from our classrooms that we think could work well within our congregations or what differences do we see between those two contexts, and how can we begin to bridge that gap so that we all can be better disciples together. So my two questions for our conversation are, what classroom practices and resources do you use in your classrooms that might also work well in local congregations? And what are your pedagogical commitments when teaching about gender, sex, and sexuality in the classroom and in congregations? Because we all are fulfilling that teaching role, whether we're currently serving as faculty or pastoring in local churches. Thanks.